With Kim Jong-un, the 28, 29-year-old new leader of North Korea, do you think China really has the capability, if they wanted to pull his strings?
I don't, actually. I think it's a misconception here in the United States that China could actually simply tell Kim Jong-un what to do, and then he would do it. You know, as we often here in the United States don't have complete leverage, don't have the authority to dictate to smaller states for whom, for example, we provide military assistance. We can't tell them what to do all the time. China can't tell North Korea what to do either. And that's clear, given that North Korea had its most recent missile test during, China's Spring Festival, which irritated the Chinese to no end. They thought that this was a real slap in the face. And here is, China providing, the overwhelming majority of North Korea's energy assistance, its food assistance. It's tried to work with North Korea on economic reform initiatives, and North Korea, from their perspective, is simply, thumbing its nose at them. So I think that, there's at this point in time. China clearly doesn't have the capability to tell North Korea what to do. And the real question is whether China is going to adopt a new policy.
And that probably makes China nervous.
I think they've been nervous, in the past about North Korea, but nervous in different ways. Nervous about, a flood of North Korean refugees across China's border, if North Korea were to collapse. Less nervous about North Korea's sort of erratic behavior, and probably even a little bit about North Korea's development of nuclear weapons. I think it's always been, China's priority has been always slightly different from the U.S. priority, the U.S. and Japan and South Korea, in that, while we would say that bringing North Korea back from the nuclear brink is probably our #1 priority. For the Chinese, it was probably, not having a flood of refugees, sort of the stability of the state, of the North Korean state. I think that could be changing, that could be evolving.
It seems that China, when its demands are made upon it by the international community, they really get their backs up. I'm looking right now towards Tibet. Many people say that a solution to the Tibet problem could have been reached if it had not been for the very public international pressure. Do you see anything to that?
I think in part you can look at China's experience with Xinjiang, right, where there has not been, frankly, that same kind of international attention paid. Xinjiang lacks, sort of the Dalai Lama and doesn't have the same sort of international appeal or sort of, Nobel figurehead, sort of leading the charge.
There you're talking about the Islamist movement in Xinjiang.
Right. Also, sort of northwest China, and I think the way that they've managed Xinjiang, in many respects, has been very similar to the way they've managed Tibet, which is to say, flood the regions with Han Chinese to try to dilute the ethnic minorities, and provide for infrastructure, try to woo them by supporting the regions economically, but at the same time play hardball politically.
Well, let's move into another area. China has rapidly become a major economic superpower in the world. Most of us cannot even remember a time in which there wasn't double-digit GDP growth in China. But now there are signs it's slowing all the way down to 7.9%.
But we don't also have per capita income of $6,000, right? So they have a long way to go, in terms of their development, and that's part of their challenge, right? They really don't want to see, their GDP growth, drop to the level of advanced industrialized countries when they're not yet, at that GDP per capita. I think the implications are quite serious, actually. As I was discussing earlier, there really are a couple of pillars of legitimacy for the Chinese leadership, and one of them is that continued economic growth. And if that slows significantly, and if people feel as though they can't get jobs, if unemployment continues to rise, if they feel as though their children's lives are not going to be better than their lives, that they're not having access to an educational opportunity that is going to then lead them to a successful life, then the Chinese government has lost one of those pillars of legitimacy. And I think you will see protests via the internet, and of course, if the economy really begins to slow and you begin to see, mass layoffs or, trouble in the state-owned sector, and you have wide-scale protests, I think then you're entering a whole new realm of sort of destabilizing activity within the country.
In a recent article, you wrote that there were something like 180,000 incidents of recorded protest in China in 2010, I believe.
If you spend time, in China, or if you spend time just looking at the Chinese internet, I think you really begin to get a sense of the serious discontent within the country. Unhappiness about environmental degradation, unhappiness about corruption, which really permeates every part of society, right? Doctors that overcharge for medicines, or school teachers that say to a parent, you're going to have to pay extra if you want your child to sit next to a heater. Just the low-level petty corruption, not to mention the hundreds of millions of dollars worth of corruption, that the Chinese can now read about when they're looking at the, familial wealth of the Chinese leadership. So that kind of corruption, inequality, right? Sort of, China is a more unequal country than the United States in terms of income inequalities. I mean, that's hard to believe. It calls itself a socialist state. So all of these factors contribute to the sort of social unrest, the demonstrations that are taking place in the country.
Corruption seems to be almost ingrained in the China psyche. You can look back through the dynastic periods and see it. Mao railed against it in '53. I think even one of the previous mayors of Shanghai was executed for corruption. Outgoing President Hu, before the 18th Party Congress in his last speech, said it could be the death, it could be fatal to China if they can't get a handle on corruption. What can they do?
Well, the traditional model of trying to deal with corruption, which, as you mentioned, has been around since the founding of the Chinese state, has been to launch these anti-corruption campaigns, right? The idea that, from on top somehow you're going to be able to pluck out all the corrupt officials, try them, hold them accountable, try them in the courts and then put them in jail, and somehow this is going to signal to the rest of all those corrupt officials that, a new sheriff is in town and they shouldn't be behaving this way. In the 60-odd years or more now of Chinese Communist Party rule, that system has failed, clearly failed. The real, approach, the real issue is, fundamental reform in governance, right? It needs transparency, it needs the rule of law, and it needs official accountability.
Well, one final question before we're done. Any person who's visited China has come back and commented about issues dealing with the environment, with water pollution. Something like 40% of all the water pollution is not industrial, it's agricultural. How is China coping with their environmental and water resource issues?
China faces a really serious challenge when it comes to the environment. It faces both the challenges of a developing country, very serious land degradation and, water pollution and issues related to air pollution from cars, so also the advanced industrialized challenges that our society faces as well. So it faces the full spectrum, air, land, water, developing and developed countries. It really has yet to put in place a good system for negotiating these challenges. It invests too little, only 1.3% of its GDP. It has too few human resources devoted to the environment. Only 300 people work in the state environmental protection and the environmental protection ministry based in Beijing to guide all of their response. And it has very few resources that it can devote in many respects to environmental protection, even as the issue has risen on the agenda of the Chinese people. Civil society is at the forefront of trying to push the Chinese government to do more in terms of protecting the environment. But the Chinese government, still has as its priority economic growth. And no matter how much lip service they pay to the environment and environmental protection, fundamentally, when push comes to shove, they are about continuing to grow the economy.
Well, China is a fascinating place. Thank you for sharing your insights. It's been a pleasure having with us Dr. Elizabeth Economy. Thank you.
Thanks very much.